Sarah filled her small apartment with color. Canvases leaned against every wall, splattered with vibrant hues. Her art was her life, a kaleidoscope of emotions poured onto linen. She was a whirlwind of energy, always laughing, always creating. Even her messy bun seemed to radiate a sunny disposition. Mark, her boyfriend of 2 years, was her anchor. Where Sarah was spontaneous, Mark was steady. He was a successful accountant, meticulously organized and calm. He adored Sarah's free spirit, her infectious joy. He often joked that she brought the color into his otherwise black and white world. He supported her art, attending every gallery showing and proudly displaying her paintings in his own, much more orderly, apartment. They seemed the perfect match, a balance of passion and practicality. Their life together was a comfortable rhythm of shared dinners, art walks, and quiet evenings spent reading side by side. They talked about the future, about opening their own gallery someday, about starting a family. Everything pointed towards a long and happy life together. Then, the unthinkable happened. One Tuesday morning, Mark called 911 in a panic. He had found Sarah, gone. The apartment, usually a riot of creative chaos, was eerily still. The vibrant colors of her paintings seemed to mock the somber scene. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Sarah was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assessment pointed to suicide. A note was found near her body, filled with despair and a sense of hopelessness that seemed utterly foreign to the Sarah everyone knew. The news spread like wildfire through their small community of artists and friends. Shock turned to disbelief, then to a crushing wave of grief. How could someone so full of life, so vibrant, simply choose to end it all? It didn't make sense. Sarah was the sunshine, the life of the party, the friend everyone turned to for a boost. Mark was inconsolable. He moved through the motions of arranging the funeral, his face a mask of sorrow. He spoke of Sarah's struggles with anxiety, something she had kept hidden from most people. He painted a picture of a woman battling inner demons, a side of Sarah that no one else had seen. Everyone offered their condolences, their hearts breaking for the young man who had lost his soulmate. The case was closed, another tragic suicide in a city already weary of loss. But something felt wrong. The front door was unlocked, just as Mark had said. He'd told the 911 operator that he'd found it that way when he arrived that morning. The apartment itself was small, but cozy. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. But the light couldn't dispel the heavy atmosphere that clung to the room like a shroud. Sarah lay on the sofa, a soft throw blanket partially covering her. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. An empty pill bottle rested on the coffee table, its label clearly visible, sleeping pills, prescribed to Sarah a few months prior for occasional insomnia. A glass of water sat beside the pill bottle, half empty. It looked as though she had simply taken the pills and drifted off to sleep. The note lay on the cushion next to her hand. It was written on a piece of Sarah's favorite watercolor paper, the edges slightly frayed. The handwriting was undoubtedly hers, though it seemed shakier than usual. The words were filled with a profound sadness, a sense of being overwhelmed by life. She wrote of feeling like a burden, of being unable to find joy in the things that once made her happy. She apologized to Mark, saying she couldn't keep fighting anymore. The scene was carefully arranged, almost too perfect. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of foul play. The apartment was tidy, save for the usual artistic clutter. A half-finished painting sat on an easel in the corner, a vibrant landscape that seemed at odds with the despair expressed in the note. Even the small details seemed to support the suicide theory. The soft music playing on the stereo, a melancholic melody that Sarah often listened to when she was feeling down. The dim lighting, creating a sense of intimacy and solitude. The closed windows, shutting out the sounds of the city and creating a sense of isolation. The first responders had done their job efficiently and respectfully. They had documented everything, taken photographs, and collected evidence. They saw a clear-cut case of suicide, a tragic but understandable end to a life struggling with unseen demons. The medical examiner arrived and confirmed the cause of death as an overdose. There were no visible injuries, no signs of trauma. It was a textbook case, a sad but simple conclusion. The police officers at the scene agreed. It was a tragedy, but there was nothing suspicious about it. They prepared to close the case, another statistic in a city grappling with a growing mental health crisis. Everything pointed toward suicide. Everything seemed to fit. But still, something felt wrong. Detective Miller arrived at the scene an hour later, the "something felt wrong" clinging to the air almost palpable. He wasn't initially assigned to the case, suicides rarely required his attention. But a call from a patrol officer, a rookie named Johnson, had piqued his interest. Johnson, fresh out of the academy, had voiced that nagging feeling, that discordant note in an otherwise harmonious composition of despair. Miller was a veteran, a man etched with the lines of countless investigations. His eyes, the color of weathered steel, had seen too much of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the city. He trusted his gut, a finely tuned instrument honed by years of experience. He'd learned that sometimes, the most obvious answers were the most deceptive. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in the details that others might have missed. He didn't dismiss the initial assessment, but he didn't accept it at face value either. He moved slowly, deliberately, his gaze sweeping across the room, cataloging every object, every shadow. He knelt beside the sofa, examining Sarah's body. He noted the paleness of her skin, the stillness of her chest. He gently lifted her hand, observing the subtle discoloration around her fingertips. He glanced at the note, reading the words carefully, searching for any hint of deception. He interviewed the first responders, listening attentively to their accounts, noting their observations. He asked specific questions, probing for any inconsistencies, any doubts. He spoke to the medical examiner, discussing the toxicology report, exploring alternative possibilities. He then turned his attention to Mark, who sat slumped in a chair in the corner of the room, his face buried in his hands. Miller approached him cautiously, his voice soft and gentle. He asked Mark to recount the events of the morning, listening carefully to his tone, his body language, his choice of words. Miller wasn't accusatory, but he was observant. He noticed the tremor in Mark's voice, the way he avoided eye contact, the subtle shifts in his posture. He sensed a tension, a guardedness that didn't quite align with the grief he was expressing. As he continued his investigation, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The scene was too perfect, too neatly arranged. The suicide note, while convincing, felt somehow staged. And Mark's behavior, while understandable in the circumstances, raised a red flag in Miller's mind. He knew he had to dig deeper, to uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward suicide. He started by looking in the trash can. The trash can was a small, stainless steel bin tucked under the kitchen sink. It was mostly empty, containing a few crumpled tissues and a coffee filter. But Miller's eyes were drawn to a single, crumpled napkin near the bottom. It was a plain white napkin, the kind you get from a coffee shop. And on it, a smear of vibrant red lipstick. Miller carefully retrieved the napkin, using a gloved hand to avoid contaminating any potential evidence. He held it up to the light, examining the lipstick stain. It was a bold, crimson shade, a stark contrast to the pastel colors that dominated Sarah's apartment and artwork. He remembered seeing Sarah earlier. Her lips were bare. He had asked one of the officers to gather Sarah's makeup from her bathroom. A quick examination revealed several lipsticks, ranging from subtle pinks to muted corals, but none matched the bold red on the napkin. This was a significant detail, a discordant note that shattered the carefully constructed harmony of the suicide scene. It meant that someone else, someone wearing a strikingly different shade of lipstick, had been in the apartment recently. And that someone had used the napkin. Miller's mind raced. Had Sarah had a visitor before she died? Had she met someone at a coffee shop? Or was the lipstick a clue, a piece of a puzzle that pointed to something far more sinister? He showed the napkin to Mark, who claimed he had never seen it before. He said Sarah rarely wore lipstick, and when she did, it was always a light, natural shade. He couldn't explain the presence of the red lipstick. Miller carefully bagged the napkin as evidence. He knew it was a long shot, but it was the first concrete clue he had that suggested foul play. He needed to identify the lipstick, to find out who wore it, and to determine why they were in Sarah's apartment. The lipstick on the napkin became the focal point of Miller's investigation. It was a small detail, a seemingly insignificant piece of trash. But in Miller's experienced eyes, it was a beacon, a guiding light that led him down a path of suspicion and intrigue. He sent the napkin to the lab for analysis, hoping to identify the brand and shade of the lipstick. He also requested a DNA analysis, in case the wearer had left any other trace evidence on the napkin. The investigation had just begun. And that small piece of trash might just be the key to unlocking the truth. Miller sat across from Mark in the sterile interview room at the precinct. Mark's eyes were red and swollen, his clothes rumpled. He looked every bit the grieving boyfriend. He answered Miller's questions in a soft, measured tone, his voice thick with emotion. He recounted his morning, starting with his usual routine. He'd woken up early, around 6 a.m., showered, and gotten ready for work. He'd left his apartment around 7 a.m. and stopped at a coffee shop near his office to grab a latte and a bagel. He provided the name of the coffee shop and even recalled the barista who served him. He said he hadn't spoken to Sarah that morning. They had exchanged a few text messages the night before, making plans for dinner. He said Sarah seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. He explained that he had tried to call Sarah around 8:30 a.m., during his morning break, but she didn't answer. He assumed she was still sleeping. He tried again around 10 a.m., with the same result. He started to worry when she didn't respond to his text messages either. He decided to leave work early, around 11 a.m., to check on her. He said he had a bad feeling. When he arrived at her apartment, the door was unlocked. He found her on the sofa, unresponsive. He immediately called 911. Mark's alibi seemed solid. He had witnesses to corroborate his story, at least for the morning hours. The barista at the coffee shop remembered him, and his colleagues confirmed that he had left work early. Miller pressed him about his relationship with Sarah, asking about any recent conflicts or stressors. Mark admitted that they had had some minor disagreements lately, mostly about Sarah's art career. He said he was worried about her financial stability and had encouraged her to find a more stable source of income. But he insisted that these disagreements were minor and didn't represent any serious problems in their relationship. He also addressed the lipstick on the napkin, reiterating that he had never seen it before and that Sarah didn't wear that shade. He suggested that maybe a friend of Sarah's had visited the apartment while he wasn't there. Mark appeared genuinely distraught throughout the interview. He cried frequently, and his body trembled with grief. He seemed to be cooperating fully with the investigation. But Miller wasn't convinced. He still sensed a disconnect, a subtle undercurrent of something hidden. He knew that grief could manifest in different ways, but Mark's grief felt performative. And the lipstick on the napkin continued to nag at him, a persistent reminder that something wasn't right. Miller thanked Mark for his time, letting him leave, all the while knowing that this was far from over. The lab report confirmed what Miller already suspected: the lipstick on the napkin was not Sarah's. The analysis identified the brand as Crimson Kiss by Luxe Beauty, shade Inferno Red. It was a popular shade, widely available, but it narrowed the search. The DNA analysis was inconclusive, yielding only trace amounts of genetic material insufficient for a definitive match, likely due to the wiping action on the napkin. With the lipstick confirmed as an anomaly, Miller shifted his focus to Mark. He ordered a deep dive into Mark's background, requesting financial records, phone logs, and social media activity. He wanted to paint a complete picture of Mark's life, to uncover any secrets or hidden agendas. He discreetly interviewed Mark's colleagues, friends, and family members, careful not to raise suspicion or alert Mark to the investigation. He asked about Mark's relationship with Sarah, his personality, and any recent changes in his behavior. The initial interviews painted a picture of Mark as a successful, dependable, and loving boyfriend. Everyone described him as being deeply devoted to Sarah, supportive of her art, and always willing to go the extra mile for her. No one suspected him of being capable of harming her. However, as Miller dug deeper, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A few colleagues mentioned that Mark had seemed stressed and preoccupied in recent weeks. One friend noted that Mark had been working long hours and seemed increasingly distant. A family member revealed that Mark had been experiencing some financial difficulties, due to a series of bad investments. Miller also discovered that Mark had a history of dating women who were financially dependent on him. Sarah, with her struggling art career, fit that pattern. Was Mark controlling? Was he resentful of Sarah's lack of financial success? The phone logs revealed numerous calls and text messages to an unknown number in the weeks leading up to Sarah's death. Miller traced the number to a burner phone registered to a prepaid account. He couldn't identify the owner, but he suspected it was someone Mark was trying to hide from. The financial records showed that Mark had recently taken out a large life insurance policy on Sarah, naming himself as the beneficiary. The policy had been taken out just a few months before her death. This raised a major red flag. Miller knew he was getting closer to the truth. The lipstick, the burner phone, the financial troubles, the life insurance policy, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. But he needed more evidence, something concrete that would tie Mark directly to Sarah's death. He decided to focus on the burner phone, hoping to uncover the identity of the person Mark had been communicating with. He had a feeling that the answer lay with that mystery contact. As Miller continued to dig, the cracks in Mark's alibi began to widen. The barista at the coffee shop, while initially confirming Mark's presence that morning, later admitted that she wasn't entirely sure of the exact time he had come in. She remembered seeing him, but couldn't definitively say it was before 7:30 a.m., leaving a crucial window of time unaccounted for. One of Mark's colleagues, who had initially stated that Mark had left work early around 11 a.m., later revised his statement, saying that he might have left closer to noon. He explained that he was busy that day and didn't pay close attention to when Mark left. Miller also revisited Sarah's neighbors, showing them a photograph of Mark. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, claimed that she had seen Mark entering Sarah's apartment building around 8 a.m. that morning. She was certain it was him because she remembered seeing him carrying a large bouquet of flowers. Mark had not mentioned anything about flowers in his initial statement. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Mark became defensive and evasive. He claimed that the barista and his colleague were mistaken. He insisted that he had been at the coffee shop and at work during the times he had stated. He denied ever receiving flowers that morning. He accused Mrs. Henderson of being senile and unreliable. He said she often confused him with other people. He became agitated and irritable, his carefully constructed facade of grief starting to crumble. Miller knew he was getting closer to the truth. The inconsistencies in Mark's alibi, the conflicting witness accounts, and Mark's increasingly erratic behavior all pointed to one conclusion: Mark was lying. He decided to intensify the surveillance on Mark, hoping to catch him in a compromising situation. He also ramped up the efforts to identify the owner of the burner phone, believing that it held the key to unraveling the mystery. The pressure was mounting on Mark. He knew that the police were suspicious of him, and he was starting to make mistakes. The carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel, exposing the darkness beneath the surface. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And Miller was determined to be the one to uncover it. The small details were betraying Mark's calculated deceit. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, from a seemingly unrelated source. While poring over Mark's financial records, Miller noticed a series of regular payments to a credit card account that didn't belong to Mark or Sarah. The address associated with the account led him to an apartment in a different part of the city. Following his gut, Miller paid a visit to the apartment. A young woman answered the door, her eyes wide with surprise. She identified herself as Emily Carter. Miller showed her a photograph of Mark. Her face flushed, and she hesitated before admitting that she knew him. Miller questioned Emily about her relationship with Mark. Initially, she was evasive, claiming they were just friends. But as Miller pressed her, showing her the financial records and mentioning the burner phone, she broke down and confessed to having an affair with Mark for the past 6 months. Emily revealed that Mark had told her he was unhappy in his relationship with Sarah. He had complained about Sarah's lack of ambition and her financial dependence on him. He had even hinted at wanting to leave her. Miller then showed Emily the lipstick-stained napkin. Her eyes widened in recognition. She confirmed that she owned Crimson Kiss by Luxe Beauty, shade Inferno Red. She even had a tube of the lipstick in her purse, which she readily handed over to Miller. Emily explained that she had been at Sarah's apartment a few days before her death. She had met Mark there for a secret rendezvous while Sarah was out of town. She remembered using the napkin after applying her lipstick. Emily's confession provided the missing link in the chain of evidence. It explained the lipstick on the napkin, the burner phone, and Mark's motive for wanting Sarah out of the picture. It also shattered Mark's carefully constructed alibi and exposed him as a liar and a cheat. Miller now had a clear picture of what had happened. Mark had been having an affair with Emily, he was burdened by financial troubles, and he had taken out a life insurance policy on Sarah. He had seen Sarah as an obstacle to his happiness and financial security. He had staged her death to look like a suicide, hoping to collect the insurance money and start a new life with Emily. But his carefully planned scheme had been undone by a small, seemingly insignificant detail, the lipstick on the napkin. The secret affair was exposed, and Mark's world was about to come crashing down. Miller brought Mark back to the precinct, this time not as a grieving boyfriend, but as a suspect. He laid out the evidence before him, piece by piece, the lipstick on the napkin, Emily's confession, the burner phone, the inconsistencies in his alibi, the life insurance policy. He watched as Mark's face shifted from disbelief to anger to a desperate attempt at denial. "We know about Emily, Mark," Miller said, his voice calm but firm. "We know about the affair. We know she was at Sarah's apartment. And we know that Sarah didn't commit suicide." Mark initially denied everything, claiming that Emily was lying, that he was being framed. He insisted that he loved Sarah and would never do anything to hurt her. He tried to explain away the inconsistencies in his alibi, but his explanations were weak and unconvincing. "The lipstick, Mark," Miller pressed. "Emily admitted it's hers. She was in Sarah's apartment. How do you explain that?" Mark stammered, searching for an answer. He claimed that Emily must have planted the lipstick, that she was trying to set him up. He accused her of being obsessed with him, of wanting to ruin his life. "And the burner phone, Mark? Who were you calling? Who were you texting?" Miller continued. Mark refused to answer, claiming he didn't know anything about a burner phone. He became increasingly agitated, his voice rising in pitch. He paced around the room, his hands clenched into fists. Miller leaned forward, his eyes locking with Mark's. "We know about the life insurance policy, Mark. A large policy, taken out just months before Sarah's death. You were the beneficiary. What were you planning to do with the money?" Mark's face paled. He finally realized that he was trapped, that there was no way out. The evidence was overwhelming, and his carefully constructed lies had crumbled around him. He stopped pacing and sat down heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. He remained silent for a long moment, then finally looked up at Miller, his eyes filled with despair. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It was an accident." Miller knew that Mark was about to confess. The pressure had finally broken him. The truth was about to come out. And the lipstick on the napkin, that small, seemingly insignificant detail, had been the key to unlocking it all. The walls were closing in. Miller knew that Mark's accident confession was just the beginning. He needed the full story, the details that would paint a complete picture of what had happened that fateful morning. He pressed Mark further, his questions relentless and probing. Mark, now resigned to his fate, began to unravel. He admitted that he had been struggling financially for months. His investments had gone sour, and he was deeply in debt. He had seen the life insurance policy as a way out, a chance to start over with Emily. He claimed that he hadn't intended to kill Sarah. He had only wanted to scare her, to convince her to leave him so he could collect the insurance money without facing legal repercussions. He admitted that he had gone to Sarah's apartment that morning, carrying the flowers as a peace offering. He had planned to talk to her, to explain his situation, to convince her to let him go. But things had escalated. They had argued, and Sarah had become hysterical. She had threatened to expose his affair and ruin his life. In the heat of the moment, he had snapped. He claimed that he hadn't meant to overdose her. He had simply given her a few extra sleeping pills to calm her down. But she had taken too many, and she had stopped breathing. He panicked. He didn't know what to do. He had staged the scene to look like a suicide, hoping to cover his tracks. He had written the suicide note, mimicking Sarah's handwriting. He had placed the empty pill bottle and the glass of water on the coffee table. He had never intended to hurt Sarah, he insisted. It was all a terrible accident. Miller didn't believe him. He knew that Mark was still trying to minimize his role in Sarah's death, to portray himself as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence told a different story. The autopsy revealed that Sarah had a significantly higher concentration of sleeping pills in her system than Mark had claimed. It also showed signs of a struggle, subtle bruising on her wrists and neck that suggested she had fought back. Miller also discovered that Sarah had a separate life insurance policy, one that Mark didn't know about. The beneficiary was Sarah's sister. This provided another motive for Mark to kill Sarah, to prevent her sister from receiving the insurance money. The pressure on Mark continued to mount. Miller presented him with the new evidence, challenging his version of events. He knew that Mark was close to breaking, that he was about to confess the full truth. The investigation intensified, and the net was closing in on Mark. Emily, racked with guilt and remorse, contacted Miller. She couldn't live with the lie anymore. She had initially been blinded by Mark's charm and promises, but now she saw him for who he truly was, a manipulative and dangerous man. She agreed to testify against Mark, to tell the truth about their affair and his plans to leave Sarah. She revealed that Mark had confessed to her that he had argued with Sarah on the night of her death. He had told Emily that Sarah had found out about their affair and had confronted him. They had had a heated argument, and Sarah had threatened to tell everyone, including Mark's wife, a detail he had conveniently omitted from his initial accounts to Emily. Emily said that Mark had been furious and scared. He had told her that Sarah was ruining his life and that he needed to find a way to silence her. Emily's testimony was a devastating blow to Mark's defense. It not only confirmed the affair and his motive for wanting Sarah dead, but it also revealed that he had lied about the events leading up to her death. It painted a picture of Mark as a cold and calculating killer, willing to do anything to protect his secrets and achieve his goals. It shattered the image of the grieving boyfriend and exposed the monster beneath. With Emily's testimony and the mounting evidence against him, Mark's chances of acquittal were slim. He had dug himself into a hole so deep that there was no way out. The lipstick on the napkin, that small, seemingly insignificant detail, had led to the unraveling of his carefully planned scheme. It had exposed his lies, his secrets, and his true nature. Emily's guilt transformed into courage to tell the truth, sealing Mark's fate. The truth was finally coming to light, and justice was about to be served. The web of deceit was finally broken. With the evidence stacked against him, Mark was formally arrested for the murder of Sarah. The warrant was served at his apartment. He didn't resist, his eyes hollow and defeated. The carefully constructed facade of grief had completely vanished, replaced by a blank stare of resignation. The arrest made headlines, shocking the community that had initially mourned Sarah's suicide. Friends and neighbors expressed disbelief, struggling to reconcile the image of the loving boyfriend with the cold-blooded killer he had become. The prosecution team began preparing its case, confident that they had enough evidence to secure a conviction. The lipstick on the napkin, that small, seemingly insignificant detail, was now a key piece of evidence, a symbol of Mark's deceit and the meticulous planning that had gone into Sarah's murder. The inconsistencies in his alibi, the burner phone, the life insurance policy, and Emily's damning testimony all pointed to one conclusion: Mark was guilty. He had killed Sarah for financial gain and to pursue a new life with his mistress. The trial was set to be a media sensation, a gripping tale of love, betrayal, and murder. The prosecution planned to present a compelling narrative, highlighting Mark's motive, his opportunity, and the overwhelming evidence against him. The defense team, on the other hand, faced an uphill battle. They would likely argue that Sarah's death was an accident, that Mark had only intended to scare her, and that Emily was an unreliable witness. They would try to cast doubt on the evidence, to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. But the odds were stacked against Mark. The truth was out, and the weight of the evidence was crushing. The lipstick on the napkin, that small smear of crimson, had exposed his lies and sealed his fate. Mark's arrest brought a sense of closure to Sarah's friends and family, who had long suspected that something was amiss. They knew that nothing could bring Sarah back, but they were determined to see justice served. The journey to justice had begun. The lipstick, a silent witness, had spoken volumes. The courtroom was packed. The media frenzy surrounding Sarah's murder had drawn national attention. The trial of Mark, the seemingly devoted boyfriend accused of killing his vibrant artist girlfriend, was officially underway. The prosecution began by painting a picture of Sarah's life, her passion for art, and her seemingly happy relationship with Mark. They presented evidence of her vibrant personality, her close relationships with friends and family, and her plans for the future. They argued that Sarah had no reason to commit suicide, that she was full of life and hope. They then shifted their focus to Mark, highlighting his financial troubles, his affair with Emily, and the life insurance policy he had taken out on Sarah. They argued that Mark had a clear motive for wanting Sarah dead: financial gain and a chance to start a new life with his mistress. The prosecution presented the lipstick-stained napkin as a key piece of evidence, a symbol of Mark's deceit and the meticulous planning that had gone into Sarah's murder. They called Emily to the stand, who tearfully recounted her affair with Mark and his confession that he had argued with Sarah on the night of her death. Emily's testimony was compelling, and she appeared genuine and remorseful. The prosecution used her testimony to dismantle Mark's claim that Sarah's death was an accident. They argued that Mark had intentionally overdosed Sarah, staging the scene to look like a suicide to collect the insurance money and escape his financial woes. They presented forensic evidence that contradicted Mark's version of events, including the higher concentration of sleeping pills in Sarah's system and the signs of a struggle on her body. They called expert witnesses to testify about the toxicology report and the autopsy findings. The prosecution meticulously dismantled Mark's alibi, highlighting the inconsistencies in his statements and the conflicting accounts of witnesses. They showed how Mark had lied to the police, to his friends, and to his family, all in an effort to cover up his crime. Throughout the trial, Mark remained stoic and emotionless, rarely showing any signs of remorse or grief. He sat passively at the defense table, listening as the prosecution presented their case, his fate hanging in the balance. The evidence was damning. The lipstick whispered a story of betrayal and murder. The defense team faced a daunting task. The evidence against Mark was overwhelming, and the prosecution had presented a compelling case. Their strategy was to cast doubt on the evidence, to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. They argued that Sarah was depressed, that she had been struggling with anxiety and low self-esteem. They presented evidence of her occasional insomnia and the fact that she had been prescribed sleeping pills. They argued that the suicide note was genuine, that it reflected Sarah's state of mind in the days leading up to her death. They argued that the evidence against Mark was circumstantial, that there was no direct evidence linking him to Sarah's death. They claimed that the autopsy findings were inconclusive, that the bruising on Sarah's body could have been caused by something other than a struggle. They attacked Emily's credibility, portraying her as a scorned woman seeking revenge. They highlighted her affair with Mark and suggested that she was motivated by jealousy and a desire to frame him for Sarah's murder. They questioned her character and her motives, trying to convince the jury that she was not a reliable witness. They focused on the lipstick-stained napkin, arguing that it was a red herring, a distraction from the real issue. They suggested that someone else could have been in Sarah's apartment, someone who had nothing to do with her death. They tried to create doubt about the origin of the lipstick, suggesting that it could have been planted by Emily or someone else. They argued that Mark was innocent, that he was a victim of circumstance, wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit. They pleaded with the jury to look beyond the evidence, to consider the possibility that Sarah had taken her own life, and that Mark was simply a grieving boyfriend, caught in a web of suspicion and deceit. The defense strategy was a risky one, but it was their only hope. They knew that they had to create reasonable doubt, to convince at least one juror that Mark was innocent. The fate of Mark rested on their ability to persuade the jury. The burden of proof was on the prosecution, and the defense was determined to exploit any weakness in their case. The fight for Mark's freedom was fierce, but the truth had a way of prevailing. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood and read the verdict aloud, guilty of murder in the first degree. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Sarah's friends and family wept with relief and gratitude. Mark remained stoic, showing no emotion as his fate was sealed. The defense team looked defeated, their efforts to create reasonable doubt having failed. The prosecution had successfully proven that Mark had intentionally killed Sarah, that he had staged her death to look like a suicide, and that he had a clear motive for wanting her dead. The lipstick on the napkin, that small, seemingly insignificant detail, had played a crucial role in the trial. It had been the first clue that something was amiss, the first sign that Sarah's death was not a suicide. It had led Detective Miller down a path of investigation that had uncovered Mark's affair, his financial troubles, his lies, and his deceit. It had been the key to unlocking the truth, to exposing Mark as a cold-blooded killer. The jury had clearly been convinced by the prosecution's evidence, by the compelling testimony of Emily, and by the forensic evidence that contradicted Mark's version of events. They had rejected the defense's attempts to portray Sarah as depressed and to discredit Emily's testimony. They had seen through Mark's lies, his carefully constructed facade of grief, and his attempts to portray himself as a victim. They had recognized the truth, that Mark was guilty of murder. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Sarah's friends and family, who had long sought justice for her death. They knew that nothing could bring Sarah back, but they were grateful that her killer had been brought to justice. The lipstick on the napkin, that silent witness, had spoken volumes, leading to justice for Sarah. A life was stolen, but the truth prevailed. The system worked. Detective Miller stood outside the courthouse, the city lights blurring around him. The trial was over, the verdict delivered. Justice had been served. He thought back to that morning, to the scene in Sarah's apartment, to the initial assessment of suicide. He remembered the nagging feeling that something was wrong, the discordant note that had prompted him to dig deeper. He smiled faintly, thinking about the lipstick on the napkin. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that had unraveled a web of lies and deceit. It was a reminder that even the smallest clues can be crucial, that attention to detail can make all the difference. He had seen too much darkness in his career, too much violence, too much betrayal. But he had also seen the resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering pursuit of justice, and the power of truth to prevail. He knew that Mark's conviction wouldn't bring Sarah back, that it wouldn't erase the pain and suffering that her friends and family had endured. But it would provide a sense of closure, a sense that justice had been served, that Sarah's life had not been taken in vain. He thought about Sarah, about her vibrant personality, her passion for art, and her dreams for the future. He was glad that he had been able to uncover the truth, to expose her killer, and to ensure that he was held accountable for his actions. He also thought about Johnson, the rookie officer who had first raised the alarm. He was proud of Johnson's instincts, his attention to detail, and his willingness to speak up, even when it meant challenging the initial assessment. He knew that Johnson had a bright future in law enforcement. As he walked away from the courthouse, Miller felt a sense of satisfaction. He had done his job, he had followed the evidence, and he had brought a killer to justice. He knew that there would be other cases, other mysteries to solve, other darkness to confront. But he was ready. He was a detective, and he was committed to serving and protecting the innocent, to upholding the law, and to ensuring that justice prevailed. The lipstick on the napkin served as a reminder: never overlook the small things, for they often hold the biggest secrets. He hoped Sarah could rest in peace, finally.